There are secrets that don't die with people. They just wait silently to be found. What if the great love of your life, a man you knew as a war hero, hid a part of himself for over 50 years? What truth could be so painful that he would choose eternal silence over revealing it? For Eleanor, the answer was locked away in a dusty military footlocker ever since her husband Arthur came home from World War II. Today, she's going to open it. The journey that begins with the turn of a rusty key will uncover a legacy of pain and a love deeper than she ever imagined. Eleanor Thompson's house breathed in silence. For 50 years since Arthur was gone, every room had become a shrine to an echo, a memory of him. The air still seemed to hold the faint smell of his pipe tobacco and the ghost of his quiet laughter. But this wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was an aching silence, a tangible presence of unspoken words and unasked questions. Sitting in her worn velvet armchair, hands resting in her lap, Eleanor stared at the fireplace mantel where a lifetime of photographs was arranged. There he was, young and smiling in his army uniform, then older, his eyes carrying a weight she could never name. She had loved him with a fierceness that time hadn't dulled, but she always knew that a part of him never truly came home. He returned from Europe a hero to the nation, but a stranger to himself. The nightmares would ambush him in the dead of night, leaving him drenched in a cold sweat, trembling with a nameless terror. In those moments, she would hold him, whispering words of comfort into the darkness, but he remained distant, lost on an invisible battlefield only he could see. He had built a wall around his wounded heart, not from a lack of love for her, but from a twisted sense of protection. He believed he was shielding her from the horrors he had witnessed, but in doing so, he locked her out, leaving her to love a man whose soul she was never truly allowed to touch. The epicenter of this silence, the physical monument to his pain, sat in the attic, a dark wooden military footlocker with the initials AJT stenciled on the side. He'd hauled it up the stairs the day he got back and never brought it down again. "There are things in there that are better left forgotten, Ellie," he'd said once, his voice thick with a rare, raw emotion. And out of love and respect for the man he was, she had obeyed. For 5 decades, the footlocker remained a sealed tomb in the heart of their home. Guarding the ghosts he refused to set free. It became the symbol of everything left unsaid, the promise of an understanding she feared she would never reach. But time, which erodes mountains, also wears down the most solemn of promises. At 88 years old, with the fragility of her own days becoming more apparent, a new urgency took hold of Eleanor. The fear of what she might find inside that chest was finally overcome by a greater fear of living out her days, never understanding the burden her husband carried alone. The need to know the man behind the soldier, to finally bring peace to his memory, became an irresistible force. She wasn't breaking a promise. She was trying to heal a wound that had festered for half a century. With a determination that stiffened her frail spine, she climbed the dusty attic stairs, each step an echo in the quiet house. The dim light from a single bare bulb illuminated the footlocker, which seemed to be waiting for her. From her jewelry box, she had retrieved a small brass key Arthur had given her without explanation years ago. Her hands, gnarled with age and arthritis, trembled visibly as she slid it into the rusty lock. The sound of the metal turning was shockingly loud, a sharp click that pierced 50 years of quiet. With a breath that seemed to come from her very soul, Eleanor lifted the heavy lid. It groaned in protest, breaking a seal of dust and time. The first thing her eyes fell upon was not a uniform or a medal, but a bundle of yellowed letters tied together with a faded blue silk ribbon. And the handwriting on the top envelope was not Arthur's. The air in the attic seemed to grow thin, colder. That elegant, flowing script, so unlike Arthur's own firm, angular strokes, felt like an intruder in her sanctuary of memories. Eleanor's mind, reeling from the sight of the unknown letters, instantly retreated in time, seeking the safe harbor of the very beginning. She remembered the summer of 41, a time painted in vibrant colors, where the biggest worry was whether they'd get a seat at the ice cream parlor. Arthur wasn't a soldier then. He was the baker's son, with a smile that seemed to rise with the sun and the scent of fresh bread always lingering on his clothes. Their love was built on a simple, strong foundation. Twilight walks, secrets whispered on the porch swing, and the unshakable certainty of a shared future. In those days, their world was small, safe, and entirely their own. The war was a distant rumble, a foreign place name in the newspapers the adults read with grim faces. To them, it was just faraway thunder on a clear day, unable to touch the golden bubble of their happiness in small-town Ohio. They were planning a life, not a survival. They talked of children, of taking over the bakery, of growing old in the same house where they grew up. There was no room for uniforms, for farewells, for the kind of silence that would one day come to define their home. Their innocence was as tangible as the afternoon sun, a blessing they didn't know they had until it was stolen away. The attack on Pearl Harbor shattered that blessing forever. The news crackled over the radio, and the town's tranquility evaporated, replaced by a fever of fear, anger, and fierce patriotism. Suddenly, the boys who played baseball in the local field were lining up at recruitment stations. The war was no longer a distant rumor. It was a duty, a call that echoed from every street corner. Eleanor saw the change in Arthur's eyes before he even said the words. That easy smile was replaced by a somber resolve, a weight she didn't yet understand, but was already beginning to feel in her own heart. The conversation happened on a cold December night, under the same starry sky where they once mapped out their dreams. "I enlisted, Ellie," he said, his voice low but firm. Each word was a blow to the perfect world they had built. She pleaded, she cried, she reasoned, but she knew it was useless. He wasn't going for adventure or for glory. He was going because he believed it was the right thing to do, to protect the very world his departure was about to tear apart. That moment was the first fissure, the beginning of the trauma that would deepen over time, the first time a duty greater than their love stood between them. The farewell at the train station was a chaotic blur of steam, tears, and identical uniforms. In the middle of that chaos, he held her one last time, the rough wool of his jacket scratching her cheek. He didn't say much. The words had already been exhausted in the days before. Instead, he pressed something into her hand. It was a small wooden bird, crudely carved but smooth to the touch. "As long as you have this," he whispered in her ear, his voice thick with emotion, "I'll find my way back home. I promise." As the train pulled away, she clutched the small bird, its edges digging into her palm. Now, decades later, in the silent attic, Eleanor stared at the letters tied with the blue ribbon, and the weight of that wooden promise felt more fragile than ever. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the attic silence. Each beat seemed to ask, who was she? The poison of doubt, a feeling Eleanor hadn't known in over 50 years, began to seep into her veins. A lifetime of trust, of unquestioning love, suddenly felt as fragile as the yellowed paper in her hands. Her fingers, which had trembled from cold and age, now trembled with fear. With a breath caught in her throat, she pulled at the faded blue ribbon, and it crumbled between her fingers. She slid the first letter from its brittle envelope. The paper was thin, almost translucent, the words written in a faded blue ink, telling a story that didn't belong to her. She forced her eyes to focus on the salutation. "My dearest Arthur," it began, and the pang of pain was sharp, physical. But as she read on, the nature of the story began to shift. The letter, dated from the fall of 1944, was not a declaration of a forbidden love. It was a testament. The woman, who signed her name as Elaine, described in vivid detail the day Arthur's platoon had entered her small French village, liberating them from an occupation that had bled their community of its life and hope. She wrote not of Arthur's charm, but of his humanity. She described him wiping her little brother's dust-streaked face and giving the boy his only chocolate bar. The image the letter painted wasn't of a lover, but of a savior. Elaine wrote of how Arthur would spend nights at their family farm, not for a secret rendezvous, but standing guard in the barn, ensuring their meager provisions were safe. She detailed how he'd fixed their broken wagon wheel, humming an American tune that made her father smile for the first time in months. Each sentence was a brushstroke in a portrait of a man Eleanor recognized, the kind, helpful man she loved, but placed in a setting of horror and privation she could never fully imagine. She was reading about his goodness, about small acts of compassion that in the midst of war were as vital as food or water. Eleanor's initial wave of fear began to recede, replaced by a deep and painful confusion. Why? Why would he hide this? There was no shame in these actions. There was honor, the very honor represented by the medals gleaming dully in the bottom of the footlocker. Hiding an affair would make sense in the cruel logic of the world, but hiding kindness, hiding acts of decency. His silence, which he had always attributed to the unspeakable horror of combat, suddenly took on a new dimension. It wasn't just about what he saw, but maybe about what he did or failed to do. She returned to the letter, her eyes scanning the lines, searching for an answer, for a clue to the 50-year-old riddle, and then she found it. Near the end of the page, Hélène's gratitude became darker, her tone shifting. She wrote that her family owed Arthur a debt that could never be repaid, a debt of life and soul, forever tied to her younger brother, a boy named Jean-Luc. She wrote that the boy's spirit would forever remain in a place she knew Arthur would never forget, a place she called the Whispering Orchard. The phrase hung in the silent attic air, unfamiliar, yet heavy, with a terrible weight. What happened in that orchard? The name Jean-Luc echoed in Eleanor's mind, a name she'd never heard, yet one that suddenly seemed to hold the key to everything. She set Hélène's letter aside and plunged her hands back into the footlocker, frantically searching for something that could explain the meaning of that place, the Whispering Orchard. Arthur's absence during the war hadn't just been an empty space. It had been an active chasm, a constant presence of fear that had taken up residence in her home and in her heart. She remembered the long, silent days, punctuated only by the mailman's arrival, her heart leaping with a mix of hope and dread each time. She lived for his letters, dissecting every word, searching for signs of the man she loved behind the soldier's facade. While he was away, life on the home front continued in a strange, suspended state. The seasons changed, neighbors celebrated births and mourned losses, but for Eleanor, time was measured from one letter to the next. She clung to his promise, embodied in the wooden bird she kept on her nightstand. It became her talisman, her daily ritual to run her fingers over the smooth wood, sending a silent prayer across the ocean. But his absence was a slow erosion. She would catch herself talking to him under her breath, imagining what he would say, how he would react. She felt like half of a whole, living a life in black and white while she waited for him to return and bring the color back. The day he came back was both the happiest and most confusing of her life. She saw him step off the train, thinner, older than his years, with a stillness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The joy of his return was immense, a wave of relief that nearly buckled her knees. But almost immediately she felt the wall. He held her, but it was a restrained embrace. He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. The man who came back was not the same one who had left. The war had stolen his lightness, his easy laugh, and left in its place a heavy silence that settled between them like a cold fog. She tried at first. She would ask questions, gently trying to probe the depths of his experience, but he would shut down, changing the subject or simply leaving the room. His silence became the unwritten law of their marriage. They had a son, built a life, shared a bed, but an essential part of him remained inaccessible, locked away. His absence, which should have ended with his return, had only changed its form. He was physically present, but emotionally, a part of him was still lost somewhere in Europe, in a place she was beginning to fear was called the Whispering Orchard. That distance shaped everything, even his fatherhood. Arthur loved his son, but always with a hesitation, as if afraid to get too close, as if he didn't feel worthy of that pure love. At the bottom of the footlocker, under a pile of military maps and official papers, her fingers found something different. It wasn't a letter, but a small, leather-bound diary, worn and stained. Eleanor's heart leapt. She opened it, and Arthur's handwriting jumped from the page. Not the rounded, confident script of his youth, but a tight, almost illegible scrawl, written with a desperate urgency. The entries were short, fragmented, snapshots of exhaustion and fear. He wrote of the bone-deep cold, the endless mud, the faces of friends he'd lost. And then she saw it, the name. "Jean-Luc brought me blackberries today," one entry read. "The boy is afraid of nothing." Discovering the diary was like finding a map to Arthur's lost soul. Eleanor clutched the small book as if it were a holy relic, the first tangible piece of his suffering she had ever held. The name Jean-Luc, once a frightening mystery, now began to attach itself to a real person, a young boy. Through the next few pages of the diary, Arthur painted a fragmented but vivid picture of this French child. Jean-Luc wasn't just some village kid. He had become an unexpected light in the endless darkness of the war for the entire platoon. He was fearless, with eyes that shone with curiosity instead of fear, and he knew the woods and fields around his home better than any military map. In his short, tired entries, Arthur described how Jean-Luc became the unit's unofficial mascot. The boy would appear out of nowhere, bearing wild blackberries, an egg pilfered from his family's henhouse, or simply a smile that seemed to defy the devastation around them. He would show the GIs where to find clean water, the best spots to shelter from the rain, and the paths the German patrols didn't use. For these exhausted, frightened men so far from home, Jean-Luc was more than a guide. He was a symbol of hope, a living reminder of the innocent world they were fighting to protect. Eleanor could feel Arthur's affection for the boy growing with each entry. He wrote about teaching Jean-Luc a few words of English, and how the boy, in return, taught him French folk songs in a quiet voice. There was one entry about Arthur fixing Jean-Luc's broken wooden toy, a small task that amidst the death and destruction seemed to restore a piece of Arthur's own humanity. In these interactions, Eleanor saw a glimpse of the man she knew, the gentle Arthur, the patient Arthur, the Arthur who would one day be a wonderful father. This boy, a stranger thousands of miles away, had managed to pierce Arthur's soldier's armor and reach the man inside. This new revelation brought a wave of warmth to Eleanor's heart, a welcome pause in the building tension. The friendship between the American soldier and the French boy was a sliver of sunlight in a story that, until now, had only been told in shades of gray. She could picture Arthur, her Arthur, finding a moment of peace and purpose in this child's company. Maybe, she thought, the story wasn't as dark as she'd feared. Maybe Arthur's secret was tied to a profound affection, a connection he felt he couldn't explain when he came home to his other life. Hope began to blossom in her chest, fragile but persistent. But war doesn't allow hope to blossom for long. As she turned the page, the diary's tone shifted abruptly. The entries became shorter, more tense. Arthur mentioned increased enemy activity, the constant strain of knowing danger was always close. And then came the entry that made Eleanor's blood run cold. "Command wants to use Jean-Luc's paths for a recon patrol tomorrow. The kid is proud to help. I told him to stay back, but he insists. He says he knows the woods like the back of his hand." Suddenly, Eleanor knew. She knew with a terrible, sickening certainty. She looked at the date, and she knew where the story was going. The orchard was waiting. The fragile hope that had sprouted in Eleanor's heart withered instantly, replaced by an icy dread. She kept reading the diary, her hands steady now, driven by a desperate need to know the whole truth, no matter how devastating. The next entries were nearly illegible, scrawled by a hand, shaking with adrenaline or fear. Arthur described setting out on the patrol before dawn, the fog hanging low over the fields, the morning silence feeling heavy, threatening. He wrote that Jean-Luc was out front, moving with a quiet confidence that belied his age, a small guide leading giants through his homeland. The pieces of the 50-year-old puzzle began snapping into place with terrifying speed and clarity. The medals for valor he never wore, Helene's mention of an unpayable debt, the perpetual sorrow in Arthur's eyes. It was all converging on a single point in time and space. He described entering the orchard, the gnarled trees forming a dark canopy overhead. He wrote of the feeling of being exposed, the way every twig that snapped underfoot sounded like a gunshot in the dead silence. There was a sense of foreboding in his words, the hindsight of a man reliving the worst moment of his life. And then, all hell broke loose. Arthur's description of the ambush was chaotic, a firestorm of fragmented words, gunfire from all sides, trees splintering, yelling. He wrote of diving for cover, survival instinct taking over, firing back in the direction of the enemy muzzle flashes. It was a blur of smoke, sound, and absolute terror. He lost sight of everyone, including the boy. For a moment that felt like an eternity. The only goal was to survive, to return fire, to suppress the enemy. The firefight was short, brutal, and decisive. When the silence returned, it was more deafening than the noise. That silence was broken by a single sound, the cry of a name. It was Hélène, who had followed at a distance, worried. The platoon regrouped, counting the wounded, securing the perimeter. The initial relief of survival was immediately annihilated by the one question hanging in the air. Where's Jean-Luc? The search began, frantic, desperate, men combing through the orchard, calling the boy's name in frightened whispers. Eleanor felt the tears streaming down her own face as she read Arthur's words, feeling his panic and denial as if they were her own. He searched behind every tree, in every ditch, praying he would find the boy hiding, scared but safe. But Jean-Luc wasn't hiding. They found him near the edge of the orchard, lying beneath an old apple tree. He hadn't been caught in the crossfire. He had been hit directly. He had run, maybe to warn them, maybe to hide, and had moved into harm's way. In the diary, Arthur's handwriting fell apart completely, the letters misshapen, smudged by what Eleanor now realized were ancient tear stains. He described holding the boy's small, lifeless body, the wooden toy he had fixed still in Jean-Luc's pocket. And then came the final revelation, the sentence that was the foundation for 50 years of silence and pain. It was my responsibility. I brought him here. I failed him. The truth, finally revealed, didn't explode in the silent attic. It landed softly, but with the crushing weight of 5 decades of repressed grief. I failed him. Those 3 words, written by her young husband's hand in the depths of his trauma, were the prison sentence Arthur had served his entire life. He wasn't condemned by a military tribunal or by the boy's family, but by himself. In that moment, Eleanor felt no anger, no betrayal. She felt a wave of compassion so deep and overwhelming, it left her breathless. The wall Arthur had built between them wasn't to keep her out. It was to contain the shame and guilt he believed would contaminate her. She finally understood. His distance wasn't a rejection of her, but a twisted form of penance. He had come home from the war, carrying not just the memories of the horrors he'd seen, but the specific burden of a life he felt he had taken. Every compliment he received, every medal he was offered, every time someone called him a hero, it must have felt like salt in an open wound. How could he accept the title of hero when, in his own heart, he felt like a failure, responsible for the death of an innocent child who had trusted him? The silence was his armor and his prison cell. The tears Eleanor shed were not for herself, for the life of half-truth she had lived. They were for him. She wept for the 20-something boy who had to place a child's body into his sister's arms. She wept for the man who spent 50 years punishing himself for a tragedy of war, a moment of chaos for which he couldn't have been solely responsible. She wept for the loneliness of his suffering, for his inability to believe he was worthy of forgiveness, especially hers. She saw their entire life together in a new light. Every moment of detachment, every shadow in his eyes was not a failure of love, but a symptom of his deep, hidden pain. Her reunion wasn't with a ghost or a betrayal, but with the complete picture of the man she loved. A man who was fallible, haunted, and imperfect, and all the more heroic in her eyes for having carried on, for loving her and raising a family, all while bearing an impossible burden. She remembered his hesitant love for their own son, and now she understood the fear behind it, the fear of failing again, of being unable to protect a child. Arthur's legacy wasn't shame, she realized, but a love so resilient it had managed to grow in the poisoned soil of guilt. With tear-filled eyes, she searched the bottom of the footlocker one last time. Her heart knew there was one more thing, and there it was, tucked beneath the canvas liner, a single sealed envelope, the paper now brittle and brown with age. On the front, in his familiar script, but written with the same trembling hand as the diary, was a single word, Eleanor. It was a letter addressed to her, written 50 years ago, that he never had the courage to deliver. With shaking hands, but a new strength in her heart, she broke the seal. It was time to hear his final confession. The letter felt as if it might disintegrate at her touch, a fragile artifact from a life-altering moment. The date at the top of the page was from 1 week after Arthur's return from the war. The ink was faded, but the words were clear, etched into the paper with an intensity that cut across time. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I have found the strength to tell you goodbye, a strength I have lacked until now." Eleanor's heart stopped. The letter wasn't an explanation, it was a farewell. He wrote of his love for her, the love that was his only guiding light through the darkest years, the image of her face that had kept him alive. But then the tone shifted, plunging into the darkness of the guilt that consumed him. He confessed everything. He recounted the story of Jean-Luc, not with the fragmented distance of the diary, but with the raw agony of a broken heart. He described their friendship, the boy's trust, and the horror of what happened in the orchard. He blamed himself completely, taking responsibility for the decision to lead the patrol that way, for his failure to protect the boy. "I am not the man you remember, Ellie," he wrote. "That man died in that orchard with that boy. What came back is a ghost, a hollow shell who doesn't deserve the love you so freely give. I love you too much to chain you to a broken man." He wrote that his plan was to give her the letter, to grant her the freedom he believed she deserved, and then to disappear. He couldn't bear to live as a hero in his hometown, let alone in her eyes, knowing the truth. He intended to leave so she could find happiness with a whole man, one not haunted by ghosts. With every word, Eleanor felt the weight of his anguish, the depth of his self-loathing. It was the confession of a good man convinced of his own wickedness, the twisted logic of trauma. But the letter didn't end with goodbye. In the last few lines, his resolve wavered. "I can't," he wrote, the script becoming an almost desperate scratch. "The thought of never seeing your face again is a greater pain than the one I carry now. Seeing you at the train station was the only thing that made me feel alive again. Perhaps my punishment is not to leave you, but to stay, knowing I will never be worthy of you. So I will burn this letter and live with my silence." But he hadn't burned it. He had hidden it, a quiet testament to his darkest moment, perhaps hoping, somewhere in the depths of his wounded soul, that one day she would find it and understand. Eleanor folded the letter slowly and held it to her chest. There were no more tears. In their place was a profound peace, an understanding that transcended pain. The 50 years of silence had not been a wall, it had been a love promise. He stayed. He chose to stay with her, even feeling broken, because the pain of losing her was greater than the pain of his guilt. The truth didn't destroy his memory. It restored it with a tragic and beautiful dignity. She looked at the black and white photo of him on the mantel, the young, smiling soldier, and whispered into the quiet attic air the words he'd needed to hear for so long. "I forgive you, Arthur." There was nothing to forgive. His legacy wasn't shame, but a love so profound it had anchored him to life. Eleanor's journey into her husband's war chest didn't unearth the betrayal, but the final truth of a love tested by hellfire, and a silence forged not from a lack of feeling, but an abundance of it. By forgiving the man who never asked for it, she finally set both herself and his memory free. Arthur's story wasn't about a soldier's shame, but about the extraordinary strength of an imperfect human being who, despite carrying an unbearable burden, chose love, Again and again, his memory was finally restored, not as a silent war hero, but as a man whose greatest bravery was simply staying. What would you have done in his place? If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments if you've experienced something similar, if you know someone who went through this, or what this story made you feel. Your voice could heal someone today.